Hello, everybody. First of all, you could probably tell by my voice, but I am feeling a little bit under the weather. I definitely just spent the last 2 hours with toilet paper up my nose. So I'm just going to try to power through. Hopefully, you can bear with me and we'll keep some pep to it. But, anyways, so as you can tell by the title of this episode, we're going to be talking about the bends. The whole reason I was interested in this is actually, like I've mentioned um, a couple of times already. I can't seem to get away from them. My two favorite ladies over at MFM, but they were talking about either in a mini-sode or a full episode, um, an instance of the bends, and it sparked my interest because I'd heard of it a few times, and I'm sure many of you have as well, but I didn't really know anything about it at all. So I decided to do a little bit of a deep dive, and I'm going to share that with you here today. Oh, I'm so sorry. Let's get into it. So, first of all, what are the bends? I mean, like, how do you even spell it? That was my first question. Is it the Benz as in Mercedes or Benz as in bend over? Turns out it's the latter one. The bends, spelled BENDS, is also referred to as decompression sickness or sometimes caisson disease. That's a little bit of an older variation, but we'll get into it. It most often occurs with scuba divers who have been diving and resurface too fast. That's it. You can die from simply coming up from down below just too darn quickly. But why? What is actually happening in our bodies to get this decompression sickness? So, essentially, in simplest terms, it is the buildup of nitrogen under pressure. You ready? Because we're about to get nerdy for a second. Just to be clear, I hadn't known an ounce of this before my interest peaked. Not an avid diver over here, to be completely honest. But, anyways, when divers are descending to scary depths, pressure increases, as we know, both the pressure on the diver's body and his oxygen tank. According to emedicinehealth.com, for roughly every 33 feet you descend, the pressure due to nitrogen increases by 12 pounds per square inch. Now, you have to understand that any gas under pressure will increase as you descend, like oxygen, for example. The only issue is nitrogen doesn't have anywhere to go. Oxygen, on the other hand, isn't an issue since our body is using it continuously. We aren't using this nitrogen. So this could cause quite a buildup. And of course, it's all dependent on how long, how deep, how calm you are, and your overall oxygen use throughout the dive. And still, though, it never becomes a problem while the diver is down swimming around along the ocean floor. The real issues only begin on the way up, like I mentioned. I'll try to explain this um, best I can, but if I fail to do so, I have a great example at the end that should clear everything up for me. All right, so the diver has descended. The nitrogen has built up in his bloodstream, and the surrounding tissues and the ocean pressure is keeping that nitrogen built up inside of him. There's no escape. Now, let's say the diver, excuse me, had no prior training and simply didn't think that they were deep enough in the ocean, and they decided to quickly shoot up towards the surface. Now that nitrogen is no longer trapped under the pressure. It wants to get out now and get out as fast as it can. This could cause bubbles to form in your bloodstream, blocking blood flow, tearing blood vessels, and even causing blood coagulation. This truly sounds as horrific as it is. Um, but like I said, in case I didn't explain that well, Let's try this example. Imagine you are a Coke bottle, right? And then someone else comes along and shakes you up. The shaking essentially would be a diver descending underwater. You're good yet. The diver's good. Coke bottle's good. As long as nobody uncaps you right away. If you're shooken up and immediately open, or if a diver immediately ascends, you'll essentially explode, causing everything to be released at once. But if someone waited a little while and slowly untwisted you over time, or slowly ascended from the depths, nothing bad should happen. So I think that explains it pretty well, or at least I hope so. And now I want to tell everyone a few of the symptoms and levels of decompression sickness, or the bends, because not all of this looks the same, and no, it is not always deadly either. Sometimes you wouldn't even know you had it. The most common symptoms are, uh, bear with me for this word, musculoskeletal, which essentially just refers to your joints. So this would be aches and soreness in certain areas. Other people have reported rashes, itching, or fatigue. And as we progress through DCS or the bends, the symptoms can worsen. Difficulty breathing, coughing, and chest pain can occur. These symptoms are sometimes referred to as the chokes, referencing the breathing difficulties, presumably. A worse outcome could be on the rise if you have pain in multiple areas like the head or the torso rather than your extremities. Um, and your lymph nodes can start to swell. And finally, um, this symptom is called the staggers, um, which is a nickname for the effect that it has on your inner ear. So essentially, it affects your eardrums and it can make you lose balance, lose your hearing, and cause dizziness. So basically, if you're diving and you ever experience any of these symptoms while you're diving or within 24 hours after or 48 hours after the dive, it is recommended that you do seek treatment just in case. And with proper treatment, the bends itself, it isn't that deadly anymore if you have proper health care and safe diving practices. But that isn't how it always was. And I'm assuming that's why you're here with me today. Um, just a little bit more history first. Um, I know, I'm sorry. We'll get to the good stuff soon. Okay, so you see, I found this quite interesting. The first case of DCS, although unknown to them at the time, was before commercial diving. Way back in the 1840s, French miners had shown symptoms of the bends after breathing pressurized air in the mines that they were excavating, I guess. However, it wasn't until the 1860s and 70s, while some major bridges were being constructed, that decompression sickness became popularized or well known, I guess. So, the Brooklyn Bridge and the Eads Bridge in St. Louis, which both started construction in the late 1860s and continued into the 1870s. During this construction, both of these bridges, bo- during the construction of both of these bridges, caissons were used, which I had mentioned at the very, very beginning, if you remember. And that's spelled Caisson, caisson. These are basically just very large cylinders standing up end to end that go from below the riverbed to above the surface of the water or the river. This allows construction workers to work inside and build below sea level while staying dry and simultaneously pumping excess water out and breathable pressurized air in. And after the construction is done, these caissons are slowly filled with concrete from the bottom up and are eventually used as the foundation for the bridge. So it's a dual purpose and not wasted. During the projects, of both the Brooklyn Bridge and the Eads Bridge, workers experienced the same issues when working inside of the caissons: joint pains, aches, posture issues, and even blindness, deafness, and death. Initially, people were confused with this new mysterious illness, dubbing it the caisson disease or the bends. And this comes from, I mentioned, issues. This is difficult. I'm so sorry. So the achy joints and the suffering posture, it's a terrible nickname, but that's how you get the bends from people after years of suffering from this disease would seriously just bend over while they walked. So bad nickname, um, but it finally does make sense now. So, anyways, once people started to report these symptoms over and over again, research into the disease began. Scientists eventually realized that the pressurized air mixed with surfacing too quickly was causing little nitrogen bubbles to form in the blood of the workers. And if I'm not mistaken, the reason these workers in the 60s and 70s on the bridges inside of the caissons, they were surfacing too quickly because they had developed small elevators inside the caissons so they could lift supplies up and down and themselves much more quickly. And once they were breathing pressurized air at the bottom, these elevators would shoot them to the top, causing them to suffer from decompression sickness. These little bubbles, though, they are not quite as cute and cuddly as the ones we grew up with. And before I dive into any of the deaths that humans have had with the bends, let's just have a quick peek at some of the absolute worst things that can happen to you according to ranker.com, another wonderful website. So, number one, nitrogen bubbles can block your body's blood flow. Number two, these bubbles can destroy your muscle tissue by seeping inside, expanding, and tearing them apart. Ugh. Number three, you can go deaf, as I had mentioned before with the ear canal thingy. Number four, you can actually just pee your pants. Not fun, but it could happen. Number five, your skin could molt. Molt. This is just essentially the worst rash you've ever seen when the little nitrogen blood bubbles underneath the affected areas of your skin, causing, yeah, it looks like your skin is almost melting. Number six, you can start to seize up before slipping into a coma, which means the bubbles have now made their way into your brain. Number seven, your lungs could fill with blood. Number eight, when you cough up this said blood that your lungs have filled with, it will look foamy and frothy, like your favorite Starbucks order. Number nine, if any of the last things I mentioned worsen or weren't bad enough, they could cause you to collapse, rupture a lung, uh, brain death, or something worse. Number 10, or something worse, is death. You could die. So that's kind of the worst of the worst right there. And now that we're all finished with this science, matter of facty topic stuff, let's take a look at a few of the instances where the bends were more than harmful. So, the first occurrence I'm bringing to you is simply devastating. The article by Earyel Bowleg. Earyel, it's Earyel Bowleg. I love it, but it's tough on my tongue. So that article that he wrote, published in August of 2021, details the death of two fishermen or divers fishing near the Bahamas, more specifically off of Rose Island near Montague and Potter's Cay. Initially, authorities had responded to a call around 1 p.m. at a Montague dock. Upon arrival, The officers met the captain of the vessel, who pointed straight to his boat, and inside the boat lay two unresponsive men. According to the police liaison, Audley Peters, the crew of three men left around 9 a.m. that morning on a fishing trip. From reports, it looked like the men were planning on stopping in multiple places to catch fish. After one of those stops, um, both divers had resurfaced and gotten back into the boat. It was at this point that one of the two men suddenly collapsed to the floor of the boat, and according to the article, quote, the captain then stopped the vessel and began to render first aid. At that time, the second diver realized that his colleague might have been suffering from what is known as the bends. He then jumped overboard in an attempt to decompress his body. While the captain was rendering first aid to the first victim, he noticed that the second diver, while overboard, was floating. So that he then stopped his assistance and retrieved that diver from the water and attempted to render first aid again. However, he ended up having to bring both victims back to the dock there on Montague. Now, that is just terrible. Like, one man goes down, and the captain's like, oh crap, let me try my best to help you. And then the next second, he looks over his shoulder, and the other guy's just floating unresponsive in the water. So scary. But as of the publishing of this article, the deaths had not yet been classified, but it seemed like a general assumption that they did pass due to decompression sickness. This was obviously a terrible incident and must have been quite the shock, because both men were between 40 and 60 years old. And I can't imagine that this would have been their first time fishing in that style. A simple day on the water turned tragic. And the poor man who had to bring them back to the dock, just knowing that both of them were gone well before reaching it, must have been horrific. I can only hope that this accident only helped other people in the same area to be safer and practice safer diving practices to avoid um, accidents like that in the future. Anyways, let's move on to one more case of caisson disease. And as a fair warning, this one's a little bit frustrating. So, in 2012, British tourist Melanie Stoddart had taken a holiday or vacation for us Americans in the Maldives. According to her family, she was an experienced diver, having completed hundreds of dives everywhere across the world. And only 3 days into her holiday, Melanie, along with 12 other people and two instructors, headed to Volvo Atoll for a scuba dive just before evening, which is one of the many, many islands of the Maldives. According to the inquest that had been done after, Melanie had been diving for roughly 30 minutes, after which she resurfaced and asked for medical assistance due to feeling unwell. And it seemed like she would soon be taken care of. Doctors were immediately called and she was rushed to a nearby aquatic resort. But the ball was soon dropped, and in a very big way. So, the first doctors to see her were almost certain it was decompression sickness and that she needed to be put into a decompression chamber. But they didn't have one and they didn't have any transport available. Now, we have to remember that they are in the Maldives, a place with many places. In fact, there are at least 132 resort islands alone, with over another 1,000 non resort islands among the Maldives. Now, I personally don't know the logistics of island living, but it must be incredibly difficult to coordinate emergency responses and medical help or medical facilities evenly dispersed through thousands of islands. So try to keep that in mind as we progress through the story, even though there were plenty of mistakes made. So finally, after an unspecified amount of time, a boat for Melanie had arrived, and they had come from another island 40 miles away. And now this is the frustrating part I told you about. This boat for transport had not been called until after the insurance was cleared. Like, this woman is literally deteriorating in front of these people, and they're worried about insurance. I mean, the world we live in, man. So, at this point, doctors had sedated Melanie, um, but they also deemed her not stable enough for a decompression chamber. So they have the transport, they have the option for a DCS chamber, but at this point, her body was not stable enough for them to put her in the chamber. You think maybe if they hadn't wasted time on the money of it all, the officials could have just gotten her into a tank while still in a stable condition. So now, after her first transfer with nothing done, I might add, she was now transferred a second time to another island 6 more miles away, this time to a real hospital. So they went from scuba diving to an aquatic resort to an island that had a decompression chamber, but they didn't use it. And now they are on another island with a hospital. So finally, here they took some CT scans of her chest and her head. Um, this entire process, from Melanie resurfacing to the hospital scans, had taken over 9 hours. 9 hours. And then before long, sadly, around 2 a.m. the following morning, Melanie had gone into cardiac arrest and died shortly later. Eventually, after a post-mortem examination, it was confirmed that she had died from decompression sickness after specialists had found damage in her brain tissue stemming from nitrogen bubble buildup in her bloodstream. That's a sentence. I know it's a sad sentence in a sad context, but nitrogen bubble buildup in her bloodstream. It this coupled with the fact that she had a ruptured eardrum was enough for everyone to agree that the bends or decompression sickness was the reason for her death. So, like both sorry, like with both cases, it's very sad and terrible because it's completely avoidable. We know why it happens, we know how it happens, and we know how to avoid it, and yet it still happens. Um, Peter Stoddart, he actually released a statement, kind of outlining unsafe diving practices after the passing of her daughter, um, or maybe not outlining it, just bringing attention to it. He said, "quote It is my opinion that there were no proper safety procedures in place on these islands. For a country that relies on diving for a main source of income, I would assume there would have been." He continued to say, "The time lapse was 9 hours, and that is just not acceptable. If she had been in the chamber within an hour, she would have been stable enough to deal with it." Now, who really knows if Melanie would have lived or not, but she definitely would have stood a much better chance of survival. A much, much better chance. Um, so, guys, ladies, everyone, those are the two cases of the bends that I really wanted to cover today. But there are just so many more out there, and even more unreported or undiagnosed. Um, it's just yet another invisible, irritating way that the world wants to kill you. Like, I feel as if this should only exist in Australia, where literally everything wants to kill you, but I digress. Anyways, here's to another abrupt ending. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you learned something. Love, love.